I just want to say that I think it's important to always come to such meetings or any meeting for that matter with a goal in mind. And in that regard, I think about what a friend told me once. Some of you may know this person, Kim Kuska, used to participate in Lost Lake Christmas bird counts. Once he told me that when thinking about coming to meetings like this, he said that if I can learn one new thing, it will have been worth it. And that's something that I've always appreciated, and that's sort of been my motto too. in attending these, that's my goal, is to learn one new fact. So that's my goal for you all, is to learn one new fact. So with that, let's get started. So to set the stage, this talk is about Fresno area birds and sort of more common birds. I said in the write-up for this talk that if you're familiar with the Fresno and Madera birds column of the yellow bill, you'd get the sense that all we care about is rare birds. And that's because that's sort of largely what the focus of that column is. However, I find huge inspiration in just the local and common birds. And so I wanted to spend some time talking tonight about those birds. And I've just selected 21 species, not quite at random, but just that jump out at me for various reasons. So again, to set the stage, I wanted to talk about our bioregion, the Fresno area. This map is from a talk I gave, I don't know, a couple of years ago on avifaunal change over the last 100 years based on John Tyler's work from the early 1900s, where he cataloged all the birds that he had seen in the early part of the 20th century. And so what the map shows here is the outline of what he called the Fresno district, which is really just on the valley floor where he worked as an agricultural inspector. And it represents this light area is area of limited rainfall, and an area that's now recognized widely as the San Joaquin Desert. And you can see Fresno is just on the edge of that area, in an area that historically was grassland. So this was largely grassland, and then most of this portion of the Fresno district was upland scrubland that looked like this. So you can imagine, things look quite different back then than they do now. So I wanted to just give you that as a backdrop so you can understand some of the changes that I'll be describing in this talk. So to start off with a very common familiar species, the Canada goose. So just within the last couple of decades, really, we've seen a tremendous population growth in the Fresno area with the establishment of ponding basins in particular. But Canada goose was, historically just a migratory species in our area, would show up in late fall and spend the winter in some of the wetland areas, mostly on the west side of the valley, where it still shows up as a wild bird. Historically, when we hadn't channelized all the rivers and creeks, and those rivers and creeks would flood in the winter, I'm sure there was habitat for Canada goose back then. But since then, it's been using mainly ponding basins, water features at parks, and then feeding on the grass, the lawn areas at these parks and in the ponding basins. So Canada goose is unusual in that it eats almost entirely grass, so it's sort of like the avian equivalent of cattle, of a cow. It's quite unusual because most birds, it takes a lot of energy to digest that, and you carry around a lot of biomass. So it'd have to be sort of a big bird to even be able to do that and still fly. Anyway, the point of this really is just to talk about this change in distribution where these formerly migratory populations lost their migratory habit and birds have just, Canada geese have just, their population has burgeoned over the last, really even the last 20 years. When I first started keeping track of Fresno area birds for Fresno Audubon, their numbers were, you'd see, maybe tens here and there, but not hundreds. And now we see hundreds all over the place. And that's something that's been really evident as I've been keeping records. This is just a really not a very old range map for Canada goose. And you can see that the Fresno area is the non-breeding area for it. So just this, I think this map is maybe 10 or maybe 15 years old. And so, these populations now we should see a purple area in the Fresno region. Okay, moving on to the next one, which is ringneck duck. Different story, but also one representing a changing population and distribution. So I liked this photo just because it shows the chestnut ring around the neck for which the bird was named. And I've heard a lot of people wanting to call it a ring-billed duck for obvious reasons. But of course, because this chestnut ring just doesn't show up usually when we observe it in the field. But if you can imagine back in the day when the species was described, it was described based on a bird that was shot. And so you had it in the hand, and then you could say, oh, wow, this is distinctive. And so hence the name. But I know many, especially new breeders, are confused and want to call it the ring-billed duck for that ring. Anyway, this species just within the last 10 years, maybe even 5 years, started nesting at high elevation lakes in the Sierra. And it nests in emergent vegetation. And here's a distribution map. Again, sort of the Fresno County area, Madera County area is south of this purple year-round range. So it's just within the last 5 to 10 years that it's been expanding southward. And it can be quite abundant on the rivers and lakes and ponding basins in our area. Again, historically, those features weren't in the Fresno area. And so species like ringneck duck were just super scarce in John Tyler's day. A similar story is that of bufflehead. So bufflehead, unlike the ringneck duck, is a cavity nester. So it nests primarily in cavities that are excavated by northern flickers. This cavity here is actually larger than what is typical. Usually they prefer a cavity that's just big enough to fit into. This one has sort of a natural feature, I think, or scarring that makes the cavity a little bit large. But typically they're northern flicker cavities up at high elevation lakes. And get to the next range map here. So you can see this, again, this range map is about 15 years old. You can see in California, it was known just to breed in the northeastern corner of the state, but it has been expanding its range southward, not for any reason like I explained with the Canada goose, although potentially all these ponding basins that we've created have helped establish the breeding population, have helped encourage breeding farther south, just because there are more opportunities to overwinter in this area. In John Tyler's day, I think he had heard rumor of a bufflehead in the Fresno district, but had never actually seen one. So now, they're quite common on the ponding basins, on the river, on the lakes. And then one more that is very similar in that regard is common merganser, also a cavity nesting species, but common merganser is substantially larger than the bufflehead, and it primarily uses cavities that are excavated by a pileated woodpecker, but also nests up at high elevation lakes and along rivers at high elevation. Just within the last, same story as the bufflehead, just within the last 5 or 10 years, people have been reporting broods of of young at high elevation lakes and rivers, indicating that, that the species has been expanding its breeding range just recently as well, like the bufflehead. And here's not the best range map, but you can still see here that the range of common merganser formerly was quite a ways north of where it exists today. So I'm going to be moving kind of rapidly through these species. Here's the next one I wanted to talk about. This is California quail, of course. California quail still manages to hang on in some of the older residential neighborhoods of Fresno. When I lived in the old fig garden area, we'd see them in that area, and I know that they hang on in some other older neighborhoods as well, where there's ample shrub cover and lots of seeds for them to feed on. Historically, they occurred throughout vineyards as well in John Tyler's day, but since the advent of clean farming practices, where we remove all the weeds with herbicides, there just aren't any weed seeds anymore around for to sustain California quail in those kinds of environments. So it's absent from much of the valley floor now, except in areas where weeds are allowed to continue to grow and where there's connectivity with maybe some natural lands like along the river or the rivers. So California quail has an interesting life history with respect to its breeding strategies, in that it can be monogamous, polygamous, or polyandrous, meaning that males may mate with other females and females may mate with other males, and she may lay eggs from multiple males in one nest or in multiple nests. And then when the young hatch, they form what are referred to as creches, where they unrelated birds from different nests can come together. And so you might see a male, and sometimes a male and female, with a brood of young, and you think, oh, well, they're all related, but when in fact they very well may not be. They may have different mothers and fathers, and there's not really a clear way to determine that. The other thing I find super interesting about California quail has to do with their foraging habits, and they feed a lot on the seeds of clover, and this is one called subterranean clover. It's in fact a non-native species that occurs along coastal areas in California. And in the 1930s, Starker Leopold, who was affiliated with the Berkeley Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, did some work looking at their foraging habits, and discovered that during drought years, California quail had reduced brood sizes, or they didn't breed at all, and wondered how they went about that. And what was determined was that plants like subterranean clover, and I'm sure other clovers, have what's called a phytoestrogen that gets concentrated in the seeds during periods of drought. And so effectively the California quail were eating birth control, and so just weren't able to produce eggs. Anyway, I've always found that sort of one of the more interesting ecological stories out there. All right, moving on to the next common species. Of course, mourning dove. Mourning dove is one of the most common birds in North America. The population estimated over 300 million birds at any one time. And sometimes you might wonder, well, how could it be so successful when it builds nests in crazy places, like on the hoods of or windshields of cars, on chairs and benches, in rain gutters, and not only that, but they build just poor quality nests, right? There, you can see that if this nest was in a tree, the egg would just fall through, as would the squab, and hit the ground, and that would be the end of them. And in fact, during the spring, this is one of the most common eggs that I find around is a mourning dove egg that has fallen out of the nest and may be carried off by a predator and dropped somewhere else. But look for these just all white eggs come the next spring and summer season. Now, even though I'm talking about spring and summer season, one of the secrets to the mourning dove success is that it's capable of nesting during any month of the year. And and there are records for every month. And it does typically nest about 6 times during the year. It just produces 2 eggs and 2 young. If they're lucky, you can see that there's 1 unhatched egg and 1 young, and there are 2 young here, but only 1 here. So they're not always, obviously not always successful, even when both eggs hatch, but they're just persistent. You know, they will nest anywhere and often. And so if they lose an egg or a chick, they're just right back at it soon enough. So yeah, they're pretty remarkable in that regard. And then, like all doves and pigeons, they have an unusual habit of producing a secretion from their crop that's referred to as crop milk. So they're feeding their young milk, which is really unusual for birds. And so this is the same for rock pigeons and band-tailed pigeons. All doves and pigeons have this habit of creating this secretion in the crop and feeding that to their young. As their young age, they will feed them seeds, but early on, they're just fed this crop milk. Okay, moving on to Anna's hummingbird. Anna's hummingbird, actually, like mourning dove, which I didn't mention, and even California quail are some of the best studied birds in California. They're common, they're widespread, and so they've been a favorite to study over the years. So we know quite a lot about them. In the case of the Anna's hummingbird, it's shown here with a fuchsia flowered gooseberry, which is a species that is native to the California coast. And here, I'll show you the next slide here. So this is the distribution of fuchsia flowered gooseberry from the Bay Area on down through San Diego County. And if this map extended farther, you would see that fuchsia flowered gooseberry extends down into northern Baja California. So historically, up until about the 30s, this mirrored the range of Anna's hummingbird. So Anna's hummingbird's range overlapped perfectly with that of the fuchsia flowered gooseberry. And it's, for various reasons, it's been thought that the 2 species co-evolved. Fuchsia flowered gooseberry has these pendant flowers with long stamens. The only birds capable of, or even, they're not even any insects capable of extracting the nectar, just Anna's hummingbirds, and now other hummingbirds as well. But Anna's was the only one that was around when the species flowers, late winter, early spring. So anyway, the 2 of those species are thought to have co-evolved in California. This is the range of Anna's hummingbird now. And of course, we have planted all kinds of ornamental plants with flowers that produce copious amounts of nectar that Anna's hummingbirds frequent. And so it's been able to take advantage of all those and expand the purple again as year round. So it used to be just along the coast from the Bay Area south to Baja California. Now that range is substantially larger, really just as a result of all these ornamental plantings. Anna's hummingbird is also well known for its singing. So not many hummingbirds are sing conspicuously. Anna's hummingbird, we see it singing all the time. It doesn't sound like much to our ears, pretty scratchy sounding, but in fact, it's quite complex and it's learned, which is really unusual for a non-passerine bird. So yeah, they're a pretty large dialect, and they learn by listening to neighboring Anna's hummingbirds. The other thing that when we think of Anna's hummingbird, we think of that popping sound that the males make during their dives displays. And this was an interesting puzzle that lasted for decades, which is that no one really knew how the sound was produced. It was initially thought back in the 20s or 30s that the sound was vocal. And in fact, there was one of the most famous biologists out of California, Luis Baptista, who studied song acquisition and among birds in California, theorized that it was a vocal sound. But in fact, back in the 20s, there was a meeting of the Cooper Ornithological Society held in Fresno. And at that meeting, a guy got a switch of bamboo and had attached the tail feathers, maybe even the wing feathers to that, and would whip it around and would make a sound very similar to that popping sound that Anna's hummingbirds make during their dive display. So based on that, that person suggested that in fact it was a mechanical sound made with the tail feathers. It wasn't until just a few years ago that researchers were able to verify that by experimentally manipulating the feathers. So it turns out that R5, this outer tail feather, is the one that's responsible for making the sound, and it just vibrates. The vane vibrates when it hits that certain speed and pulls up, and it makes that popping sound. So they were able to remove those tail feathers and find that, okay, well, birds can no longer make it when they do that. And then they were able to do experiments in wind tunnels and various things to also demonstrate that the sound is in fact produced mechanically using the outer tail feathers. The birds will spread the tail just like this at the bottom of that dive display to make that popping sound. And the other thing I wanted to mention about, it's not really specific to Anna's hummingbirds, but hummingbirds in general, and many of you may know this, but they lay just 2 eggs, kind of like the mourning dove. But unlike the mourning dove, the female Anna's hummingbird does all the work. She builds the nest, she incubates the eggs, and she feeds the young. The male's only role, of course, is to fertilize the eggs. And that is even a challenge for the female. So the male's job is to defend a territory, and the female will enter that territory, and the male will instinctively attempt to just chase her off. And he will persist in doing that many times, but eventually you'll get the hint. And then they'll copulate, and then the female will then go outside the male's territory to lay her eggs. So she'll have built her nest already, and outside the male's territory, and then after copulating with the male, she'll then head over and lay her eggs in the nest, and then the male's role is done. What a life, huh? Okay. All right, the next species I wanted to talk about is American coot. And, this one is, of course, it's not often appreciated, and certainly underappreciated, perhaps, as some might suggest. And when I think of coots, I think of friends, and it's not just because they're highly social, but because it reminds me of some friends of mine. A friend who, Laura Helmuth, who's the current editor-in-chief of Scientific American, would look at this image when we'd be out in the field, and she'd say, "Oh man, this place has a bad case of the coots." And I always love that expression. And then some of you, I'm sure, know Howard Clark, who was past president of Fresno Audubon and past editor of the Yellow Bill. He has a particular fondness for coots, and even has created a Facebook page devoted to coots. So we went up to the Sacramento Wildlife Refuge early this year, and he saw a mounted coot, and that's the first thing he went for, to get a photo of the coot. Anyway, moving on. Oh, then the other thing, another friend, Bruce Lyon from UC Santa Cruz, has studied coots for decades and doing most of his work up in British Columbia. But one of the things that he's been fascinated by, well, actually several things he's been fascinated by relative to American coots. One of the things, though, has to do with this colorful plumage of the young. So coots build these floating nests, tied together with emergent vegetation, and they lay a large number of eggs, up to like 12 eggs. And their strategy is just to maximize the number of eggs that they lay, and then depending if there are lots of food resources, then maybe they will manage to bring all those eggs, hatch all those eggs, and bring them all the young to adulthood. Typically, though, what happens is that they have to start culling them because the food resources just aren't there, and they do that in part by picking favorites to feed. And so it starts off the first 10 days after young start hatching. So young hatch, the eggs are laid one per day, and they hatch one per day. And so it may take close to 2 weeks before all the eggs hatch. The first 10 days, the adults feed the young indiscriminately. Whichever young is nearest, they feed. But after 10 days, they start feeding the ones that are the most brightly colored. And it turns out the ones that are most brightly colored are those that are the youngest. And so these youngest birds then get all of the attention. In fact, the adult coots then will, if an older chick is being too aggressive, they'll grab that bird and that young and just shake it and toss it aside, and preferentially feed the more brightly colored younger birds. And sometimes these even surpass those older birds in growth in body size because they're fed preferentially. Anyway, this results in a culling process that is all influenced by the amount of food resources that are available. All right, moving on to turkey vulture. So turkey vulture is one that I think we all appreciate just for the spectacle that they create during fall migration. So we can see large numbers just right in the Fresno area, flying over in the tens, even hundreds of birds in September and October. And then we also see them roosting in large groups. Again, also in the up to several hundred birds can roost in a grove of trees. And even right in town. Now, turkey vulture is a species that there are resident populations and there are migratory populations. So we'll see them year round, but they peak in numbers in our area in September and October. one of my, I don't really have a bucket list necessarily, but if I did, one thing on it would have been to have found a turkey vulture nest. I've always been on the lookout for one. I've as part of my career for the past 30 plus years, I've always had to find nests as part of my job, and I had never found a turkey vulture nest until last year along the San Joaquin River. It was a nest on a cliff ledge. Anyway, moving on. So turkey vulture, of course, is also pretty well known for its thermoregulatory habits, and particularly the sunning habit. So they open their wings and usually are facing away from the sun and maximizing their surface area that's exposed to the warmth of the sun. So they do this primarily in the morning, but even during winter or this time of the year, you'll see them doing this even into the afternoon when it's just colder in general. And then the other thing, I kind of threw this in for my kids who learned about this not too long ago in their biology class. Just the fact that not only do turkey vultures have a means to thermoregulate when the temperature is warm, but their temperature is cold, but also when it's warm. And so in this case, what I'm showing here are the legs and feet of a turkey vulture, and they're kind of stained whitish because of a phenomenon called urohydrosis, where they defecate on their legs to take advantage of the evaporative cooling properties. So defecate on your legs and then get a little bit of wind movement, and that cools you down. So my kids thought that was pretty weird, and so I had to throw this in for them. Okay, moving to owls. So this is Western screech owl, and it's really the most common woodland owl in our area. And historically, it occurred, primarily in the foothills and lower mountain areas, but also in where there were large trees along the rivers. Now they occur in many residential areas, which is, and this is just a phenomenon that's started maybe also within the last 15 years or so. So as trees have matured in some of the older neighborhoods and developed large cavities, owls have discovered those and taken up residence. The other thing I wanted to mention about Western screech owl is just to point out that they said they have these yellow irises. What you can't quite see are the ear tufts there, but I don't know if you know that these are features of crepuscular owls that are active mostly at dawn and dusk. And these yellow irises and the ear tufts serve to signal to other owls. So they're communicating various things, mostly probably just, hey, I'm here. And I was thinking about this evening just before this talk. I was going for a walk at Jensen River Ranch and saw a couple of great horned owls at a distance in a leafless cottonwood, and immediately knew what they were because I could see their ear tufts. So even though the light level was really low, it was clear that they had those ear tufts, and so they're signaling the same sorts of things to each other. But if you compare that with strictly diurnal owls like barn owl has no ear tufts and all dark eyes. Same with spotted owl, say, very similar features. Okay, moving on to Nuttall's woodpecker. This is one that like the Western screech owl has moved in and become fairly common in older residential areas of the Fresno region, following primarily the planting of oaks. So it's closely tied with oak trees, but we've planted a lot of ornamental oaks, and the Fresno area. And as those have matured, the Nuttall's woodpecker has moved in. So like Western screech owl, it was relegated primarily to the foothills, and then and along the rivers where there were large mature trees, oak trees in particular. And then it's just expanded its range into town with the planting of those mature oaks. The other sort of interesting thing about Nuttall's woodpecker is that it is nearly a California endemic, just extending into northern Baja California a little bit. So it has quite the restricted range. When I was running a research station in Big Sur years ago, we'd get a lot of birders that would come from around the country to visit. And I remember when I started to really appreciate the limited range of Nuttall's woodpecker was there when a couple of folks from Texas encountered me out wandering around in one of our study areas, and they said in their Texas drawl, "Hey, we're from Fort Worth. Can you tell us where we can find a Nuttall's woodpecker? And how about a ram tit?" Anyway, I thought that was great, but it also just made me realize that both of those species have a very restricted range. All right, moving on to some flycatchers here. Similar sort of story as I've been talking about with a lot of these birds, with these changes in their ranges. Black phoebe and sage phoebe both have expanded pretty widely, black phoebe more so than sage phoebe, into our area. So black phoebe is very much tied with water. And historically, again, if you remember that range map that I showed that showed annual precipitation levels, there just wasn't a lot of water in a lot of the Fresno district. And so now with all of our ponding basins and irrigation canals, and even swimming pools, black phoebes have been able to take advantage of the insects primarily that are associated with those features. And they also, of course, need mud to build their nests. And so they require water for that as well. I included this photo just to show that although black phoebes are mainly insectivores, that they do occasionally take fish. And Gary Woods was fortunate enough years ago to find a drying pond that had a bunch of mosquito fish in it. This isn't his photo here, but he has lots of great photos of not only black phoebe, but lots of other species, some that are never described as having been piscivorous, eating these mosquito fish just because it was just an opportunity, right? Lots of mosquito fish there, huge source of protein, easy to get. And so, he had Buick's wrens and all kinds of things eating fish. Sage phoebe is a little bit different in that it doesn't require that water. It's a species more associated with arid scrublands and grasslands. It has moved into our area just recently as part of an expansion throughout the San Joaquin Valley, it seems like, or even Central Valley, extending up into the Sacramento Valley. Just within the last few years, it has established, we've got breeding records now from many parts of the Fresno area, and it seems to be on the outskirts of town near new developments where they seem to take advantage of houses in these new developments. So they still need these open areas for foraging, unlike the black phoebe they can feed in pretty tight quarters and backyards and that sort of stuff. Sage phoebe they still need open country to forage. So where housing developments are at the outer edge of town, sage phoebe seem to be moving into those areas. And I don't know that they'll last very long, but they've been breeding in my neighborhood in northeastern Fresno now for the last, I guess, just 2 years, or maybe it's 3 years now. But anyway, both species are also double brooded, so it's not all that common. but it's typical for phoebes to have 2 broods per year. So that allows, especially the black phoebe to become quite abundant, take advantage of all the habitat that we've created for it. All right. Moving on to American crow, another underappreciated species. I included these are birds that are heading to a night roost, and I included this because of a phenomenon that I was fortunate enough to witness several years ago when Larry Parmeter used to run the Milburn Christmas bird count. And that included a portion of Highway 99 down to Ashland or so. And there are all these eucalyptus trees along Highway 99. Anyway, American crows, you see them this time of the year and through the winter forming these large flocks that come in from feeding out in the agricultural fields during the day. And they will make these flights toward town, becoming, they'll make stops along the way. And as they get closer to their night roost, the numbers along at these various stops will grow. They'll be bigger and bigger. And they will form these pre-roosting aggregations that can be in the thousands of birds. And sometimes they're just on the ground. And so that was the interesting thing about these birds at Ashland and Highway 99, is that these birds were just resting on an open field. And as I recall, we counted over 10,000 American crows just standing on the ground. And they're, at that point, they're sort of exchanging information about foraging, engaged in other social behavior on the ground just before they go into roost for the night. But it was just quite the spectacle to see so many birds of any species, really, but just especially on the ground, just wandering around and chatting before they headed up to the eucalyptus along the highway for the night. Okay, moving on to bush tit. So bush tit it's the only member of the Agathalidae family in North America. All the other 12 representatives are from Eurasia. They all build these pendant nests, and this nest is quite elaborate. It's sock-like and made of various lichens and mosses and held together with spider silk, and it's quite insulative. Bush tits begin nesting in January and February when the temperature is quite cold, and this nest serves to provide really good insulation from those cold temperatures. These nests take a long time to build. The average time to build one of these nests is 33 days. It can take up to 52 days to construct one of these nests. So it's not an easy task. Most birds build their nests, smaller birds build their nests in just a few days. So taking more than a month to build a nest is quite an investment. So bush tit is one of the first birds that was ever known to have helpers at the nest. So back in the 20s or 30s, it was first documented that bush tits sometimes have what are referred to as supernumeraries, not just a male and a female, but another bird, and that, or sometimes multiple birds, and that other bird or birds can be of any age and any sex. So most often, I think from most studies indicate that most often it's a male that either was unmated or had a failed nest. And rather than starting, they could just not breed for that year, or they could start over, or they could join a nest that's already in progress, and maybe they might have a chance to contribute genetic material to that nest. No one has really been able to study that component, but it's assumed that at least they might be able to somehow have an opportunity to either lay eggs or fertilize eggs in those nests. Bush-tit also is another species that has moved into the Fresno area with all of our plantings of various trees. So it's now quite a common species in town. This is not often, I think we birders tend to forget that male and female bush-tits are readily separable in the field, based largely on eye color. So females with the pale colored eye and males with the dark eye. Females also tend to be browner, and in fact, they can look quite wren tit-like overall with that coloration and that yellow eye. All right, moving on to American robin. Again, I wanted to hit just a lot of these common birds that we see all the time, but don't really think much about. Oh, it's just another robin. So robins are interesting for many reasons. The reason that I wanted to talk to you about was and something that I appreciate about them is that they, we all know their song, but what you may not realize unless you're up early in the morning or out late in the evening is that they are one of the first birds to start singing in the morning and one of the last birds to stop singing during the day. And that's, it really has probably the longest singing time of any, of just about any bird, except for the next one that I'll show you, of any bird in California, in our area. This long singing period, and especially singing during low light levels, is probably related to the physiology of its eye, which allows it to see during low light levels. And it probably, I'm not sure that I've read this anywhere, but birds like that tend to have also larger eyes in general, for proportionally to their body. All right, moving on to northern mockingbird. So northern mockingbird is a famous singer and probably sings maybe longer than even American robin during the day. Both males and females sing. They can have up to 150 song types, and it can, unlike most birds, it can learn these songs throughout its lifetime. So if you think of like a white-crowned sparrow, it has a very limited window in which to learn its song. And in fact, if it doesn't learn its song, they say it's not exposed to a male that is singing during this learning period, then it'll just sing gobbledygook its whole life. And this has been done experimentally by Louis Baptista and others. But northern mockingbird can learn songs throughout its entire life, always learning new songs. And what this does is it means that its neighbors and its potential mates won't get bored, basically. So it's maximizing its singing ability, which is impressive to its neighbors and to its mates. European starling threw this in to say that one of the things I appreciate about this bird is the fact that what we see here with its fresh fall plumage and its breeding plumage is not the result of molt. So this is due to feather wear. So all these white spots lack melanin, which make up the structural components of all the other dark feathers that are resistant to wear. So these white tips all abrade, they all fade off just with wear as time goes on. And so come spring, European starling is nice and glossy like this, almost oily looking and iridescent just through feather wear. So unlike most birds that have to go through a molt to generate a different plumage. All right, and then that brings us to California scrub jay and cedar waxwing. And I included these because one of the things that I appreciate about these birds in particular have to do with their feeding habits. And with California scrub jay, it's what's called a scatter hoarder. And you've all seen this, where they will cache, if you've got a feeder in your backyard, they'll cache peanuts and bury them in various places in your yard. Of course, in the wild, they do out in natural areas, they do the same thing with acorns, caching the acorns in various places. And they typically are caching acorns from September through into December, and then they're digging those up in sort of beginning in December and through April. They, however, don't always find them or don't always recover them. And this is thought to be responsible in part for the dispersal and regeneration of oaks in California. So this idea first occurred to Joseph Grinnell, who was the founding director at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley. He was looking at a hillside that had oaks on it, quite a steep hillside, and it was in the fall. He was looking up, and I think maybe an acorn fell and noticed it just rolled right down the hill, and thought, how do the acorns get uphill? They've got to get uphill for these plants to be able to regenerate. And then he saw a California scrub jay carrying an acorn and caching it in the ground. And so he wrote up a little paper called Uphill Planters in the early 30s, describing that phenomenon. Now, the other thing too that I appreciate about California scrub jay, as well as Steller's jay, some of you may have heard this before, but they were familiar with their squawking sounds, but they also have songs. They're quite complex and melodious, but they're whisper songs. They sing them very quietly. Both males and females do it, and they'll sing quietly during courtship to one another, and they also sing by themselves. And I've heard this several times in the field where I'm just out by myself and I hear this very quiet song, and eventually I get a look at a jay and it's just quietly singing. And sometimes, like I said, just by itself, no other bird around. That's pretty interesting. Cedar waxwing is another one that is really an agent for seed dispersal. It specializes, of course, on really sugary berries, and very few birds are capable of just sustaining themselves on sugary berries. Now, cedar waxwings during the nesting season will fly catch for insects and feed those to their young and eat them themselves. But for most of the year, they're feeding on berries and digesting those. And along the way, because they move so widely and they're defecating as they go, they are dispersing these seeds all over the place. And so a lot of these plants are getting dispersed thanks to cedar waxwing. Okay, the last species that I wanted to talk about is house finch. And I think many of us are familiar with the various color morphs. The red is the most common, but they're also orange and yellow. Now, red, orange, and yellow are colors that are not produced intrinsically. They have to come from diet, and so they're associated with carotenoid pigments, which only certain plants and invertebrates are capable of generating. So the birds must find these plants or seeds that have these carotenoids, and then they metabolize those carotenoids, and then they go into the follicles of the feathers and produce these colors that way. And all of this can also be experimentally manipulated to change colors and all of that. and that's been done. Most recent research on this is, so originally it was thought, well, these differences in colors have mostly to do with the availability of those carotenoids in the environment. And that's partly true, but ultimately what the researchers who study this have determined is that the color and the intensity of that color is largely a function of the overall health of the bird, the overall fitness of the bird, its ability to produce young. And the brighter it is, and generally the redder it is, the more fit it is. And this results in what's called honest signaling, so that they're providing an honest signal to females about their overall fitness for producing and raising young. So the brighter males being the most fit, and the dullest ones being the least fit rather. So I think that's all that I have there. Just end with this Wendell quote, which I think is particularly poignant during these times of COVID and social unrest and the recent political campaigns. All right, with that, I think I will attempt to find the chat, see what questions we have. Okay, so we have a question. Do you have any suggestions for setting up a blind to get better pics of birds? And I actually don't have any experience with this. Certainly Gary Woods does. I don't know if he's on this, participating in this, this meeting, but he'd be the one to ask. But I know that he has a portable blind that he does use at times. Of course, it requires incredible patience, but yeah, I would defer that question to Gary. Next question is, if anyone has any questions. Oh, yeah, okay, that's to me. How is it the mourning dove is so successful throughout all the United States? Does it migrate in the really cold states to warmer ones, then back? So it manages to be resident in most areas. There is a lot of seasonal movement in mourning dove, but it is resident everywhere. And it's just it's a hardy bird. Now, the other thing to mention about it, though, is it's very short-lived. The average lifespan is only about a year. So if you think about it that way, you think about like insects, which have very short lifespans, but produce lots of young. They're sort of like the insect of the bird world. That's part of their strategy, is just to crank out as many young as they can in 1 year. Let's see, next question. How long did you say the overlap between the fuchsia flower gooseberry nectar and Anna's hummingbirds recorded for? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. If it has to do with how long did the two ranges overlap perfectly before Anna's began to expand its range. It was up through the 30s, 1930s, I think, until Anna's hummingbirds really started to expand beyond that initial range. So another question is, are turkey vultures related to red-tailed hawks? That has, that's been a source of not necessarily debate, but the thinking has changed a lot about that over the years. Initially, it was thought, yes, they were quite closely related. And then subsequently, no, they're not actually related at all. And then more recently, just within the last 5 to 10 years, it was determined that in fact, they are pretty closely related. So hawks, diurnal hawks, and vultures are in fact quite closely related. Question from Nancy. What's your background and how did you get interested in ornithology? So I've studied birds for most of my life. I did show that cedar waxwing. That's probably the bird that kind of inspired me to really want to learn more about birds. Growing up as a kid in Fresno, I found a dead cedar waxwing on the street, and I picked it up and was just super impressed with the details of the plumage and the waxy feather tips that I just wanted to learn more. And that's sort of when I got my first bird book, and then just went on to study birds in college, and then as a profession. Another question from Nancy: what about grackles? What are the conditions that have allowed them to establish in our area? Grackles have moved north for some of the same reasons that some of these other species have that I've mentioned, and that's they're closely tied with water, and we have created all these artificial habitats for them, and so they've been able to expand their range northward to take advantage of those habitats. Have there been a marked decline in American robins in our area? Is that true? No, I don't think so. There have been some concern for declines of robins in some parts of the United States. In our area, I don't think there's any real evidence for that. Again, quite the contrary. I think, and when I say that, I'm talking about sort of longer term. We've created all kinds of great habitat for them with our lawns and our irrigation. They didn't used to appear, again, thinking back on what the valley looked like historically, just grassland and arid scrubland. We've created lots of good habitat for them, so they're quite common now. Do robins detect worms in the ground through their feet? There's been some debate about that, and about whether they're able to hear the movement of earthworms, because when they do feed on earthworms, they cock their heads. And I haven't kept up on the most recent research on that to know where the current thinking is, but I know that's been hypothesized in the past. New to birding world, is there a difference between a call and a song? Yes, there are differences between calls and songs. Calls are typically short, one or two note vocalizations that are uttered in a variety of contexts, usually not in a breeding context. So there may be a contact call with keeping tabs on your mate or your siblings, or to sound an alarm if there's a predator nearby. Those are calls. Songs are more elaborate, multi-syllables, and that are learned. So whereas calls are innate. Okay, can you attract robins to your yard? Sure, you can attract robins to your yard, one by having a lawn with irrigation, where you've got earthworms, but also, some people do put mealworms out for them, and they will be attracted to mealworms. Okay, let me see here. I think I'm getting into some repeat questions. Why would females sing as opposed to males? I thought males tried to attract females through singing, but what is the point of female singing? So yes, primarily males are the singers with most birds. However, females in some species also have a need to defend territories. In the case of northern mockingbird, they do maintain a territory, both feeding territories and breeding territories, and the females, they're year-round residents, and the females do have a need. Their repertoires aren't quite as expansive as the males, though. Okay, I think that may be it for the questions. And Gary has responded saying that he uses a bag blind, which is available online from naturescapes.com. Okay, I think that might be it. Rachel or Robert, did you want to take over?
Well, thank you, Jeff. Rachel, are you unmuted? You want to go ahead?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent.
Oh, sorry, Robert.
No, go ahead.
Thank you very, very much. That was an awesome presentation. And thank you so much to everyone who attended tonight. We certainly appreciate it. Now, be on the lookout for a brief survey regarding this meeting, and fill that out when you're able. These surveys help us to know, what we're doing right, what we might improve on, and also kind of helps us to keep tabs on how people are finding out about these meetings, which in turn helps us to know how we can make these more accessible to everyone who's interested. Now, if you are not already, please follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and now we also have a YouTube channel. Now, these are great ways to keep up with us, stay engaged, and stay informed, and stay in the loop about future meetings, field trips, and different volunteer opportunities. And of course, we're always posting fun and educational content. Now, thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight, and have a great remainder of your week, and stay safe out there.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jeff.